section here. This is going to be Stephen Godley, and he's going to be presenting a range-wide analysis of the distribution, conservation status, and habitat requirements of the Florida sand skink.
Something other than gophers. For those of you who know me, know that I'm a herpetologist that has been masquerading as an environmental consultant successfully for over 40 years. What I want to do today is to talk about what we've learned about the Florida sand skink. I caught my first one over a half a century ago. I think Jack Stout and Dick may also hold a record like that. At the end, you see Unveiling the Truth. What I want you to imagine is an onion as a sand skink. You get the onion in your hand and you peel off the opaque brown skin to get to the underparts, the edible parts. Then you have to dissect away any black moldy places that might be in the published or unpublished literature, the alternative facts, until you get to the translucent truths below. And I want to talk about the last quarter century of trying to peel that onion back for you, if I can figure out. Yeah. Okay, so earlier, fortunately, Hillary gave a spectacular talk about a scrub and Lake Wales Ridge and the ancientness of these disjunct ridge systems. And one of the endemic species that's found there, of course, is a small sand swimming skink, the sand skink, with very specialized features, cylindrical, countersunk jaw, the nasals are closed up to keep the sand out, reduced limbs and also digits. 30 species of skinks worldwide live in the sand like this guy does. The key ecological drivers in all those species, though, is excessively well-drained soils. And in the case of the sand skinks, it's elevations above 25 meters, which are those high ridges that were once almost underwater. That was the only thing left in Florida. And native xeric communities that she talked about, in particular, scrub and scrubby flatwoods and that. Whoops, that's not the one. Okay, in Rosemary Balls, at work done at Archbold, what we know is there's a major spring activity peak. About 60% of the total activity of the animal occurs in the reproductive season. On Rosemary Balls, they have a fixed clutch size of 2 eggs. They produce every 1 to 2 years, not every year. Delayed female maturity, and they have a long lifespan because they have very low predation rates. At other sites, in sandhill sites, we have a site where we had a sample of 550 animals in a much more productive habitat. Clutch size up to 5, reproduction in 1 year, 20% larger in body size is variable. That's the point. This is an animal that's been federally listed since 87. The service and FWC has required standardized transects and survey techniques since 2000. So we have lots of data there. As a consultant, I've helped the service and others to fund the research that now totals over $4 million on this animal, and it's the best known lizard in the state of Florida. Still, there is a lot of controversy about a lot of things, and it's related to that onion problem I mentioned earlier. Okay, so how do we survey and how do we deal with sand skinks? That's the light, I guess. One, they leave these distinct sinusoidal tracks in the sand as they swim on the surface. It's only under the surface. And so but you can walk around and have a GPS on you, and you can count the number of tracks either per distance or per time. And if you have a GPS track and you know how much open sand there is, that's one way. Or you can use a cover board. Here's a cover board, a 2x2 cover board, and I'm hopeful you're able to see the sinusoidal tracks underneath that. That's a technique that we developed in the early 90s and now is a standard for the service. In addition, in 94, we set the first set of enclosures. This is a 20 meter by 20 meter enclosure. Here's one under construction. The pitfall traps and little drift fences inside, but you trap out the entire enclosure, catch every skink, and you know what the density is, okay? We have data now for 61 trap out enclosures at 9 sites in 4 counties on the Lake Wales Ridge, and I'll talk about the details of that. In addition, you're able to mark them with elastomers of different colors if you're not colorblind anyway, and that's how you can individually mark them. In 2012, 2013, I was working as the lead ENT species consultant for Sable Trail, the transmission line that a lot of people objected to. One of the beauties of that is I convinced them, as well as the service and FWC, to let us assemble all the data they had in their files on sand skinks, all the consultant reports, all the wildlife, anybody who's ever collected a sand skink or ever looked for sand skinks, and we assembled all those data. Colleen is in the back over here. Raise your hand. That woman there was in charge of assembling, analyzing, and QA/QCing 13 sets of data collected all the way from the 50s on up. We entered 55 different kinds of variables for each individual record. And because we were interested in the interaction between soils and also habitat, any site, if it's a lakeland fine sand, for example, that had a patch of sandhill on it and an orange grove, and we got a hit or we didn't get a hit in one or the other, it was recorded as a separate site. All the data I'm going to be presenting are presence absent data. We have the data also to do occupancy analysis and everything that has to do with that. We assembled approximately 2,400 locality records in the state of Florida for sand skinks, of which 70% in general were positive, i.e. there was records. Earlier, Hillary mentioned this particular publication, and in that publication is a map of the known distribution of sand skinks from 1985 to 2004, based on the records that she and Archbold were able to assemble. 73 records in that particular period. What do we now know? We have over 1,500 records, locality records for sand skinks. About 11% of those are earlier than 85. Archbold, mostly from FNI, had 73 records from 85 to 2004. In our onion peeling, we were able to uncover 621 records in the same period of time. And then since 2004, over 50% of the total sample came from that period. So we've learned a whole bunch, and I ought to mention that the reds are negatives and the green dots are positives in all the slides. Okay, It's the soil, stupid. I'm going to show you 4 slides why that's important, and also part of the onion peeling. One of the papers that came out, actually 2 papers by Pike and Rosnick, indicated that sand skinks occur on 12 poorly drained soils, either flatwood soils or wetland soil types. Well, I went to the consultant whom he worked for at the time and they worked for in the time and said, hey, could I have all your GIS files? Yeah, here's all your GIS files. Then I went out in the field where he collected all the samples with Lou Carter, who's a soil scientist. He mapped this county. He bored all the weird soils, all the poorly drained sites. The beauty of it is they left all the cover boards on the site. And so I had a GIS file. I could walk over here and say, this is this one. It had a sand skink under it. And then he could do a boring. What we found is that none of the skinks from poorly drained soils were in a poorly drained soils. They were all mismapped. These are 21 different localities, all mismapped. Okay, here's the database. What do we know about the database? One, the service has described 20 xeric soil types, excessively well drained, where skinks are found, and that's all of these except for the other here. The blue are positives and the reds are negatives in terms of a presence absence. About 9% of the total sample is on a poorly drained soil in the database. So there's something wrong there, maybe. What we found when we looked at these 109 records is that 57% in round numbers are errors in the soil survey maps themselves. Why? Well, they were mapped at a 1 to 20,000 scale, not intended to do this kind of work. Lou told me he would do 3 or 4 sections a day when he went out and mapped the soils in this county. He was doing a photo interpretation on a black and white image that was poorly rectified over 50 years ago. So that's a source of error. 16% were incorrect lat longs entered by ethnic. How did that happen? Steve Chrisman, whom a lot of you know, he did a massive study of all the scrubs, a lot of the scrubs on the Lake Wales Ridge. When they entered the database, he had it on a quadrangle map, so they put the dot in the middle of the quadrangle map, and in some cases, it was in a wetland or a flatwoods. But 13% are on errant soils. It's now a borrow pit or something else. 11%, including a lot from Inge and Mushinsky and others, were the vehicle location, as opposed to the scrub that was 30 meters away where they actually caught the animal. And 3% were old museum records. Here's the last of the soils. I mentioned we collected 550 sand skinks on a sandhill site. We moved them up to an upland island in the middle of Reedy Creek Swamp that used to be an orange grove that never had any sand skinks. And Osmond at the USF did an experiment here where we had 5 treatments of control, wood only, trees and wood, trees only, and also shade cloth in order to simulate the effects of a tree. 5 treatments, 3 replicates, no difference in either survivorship or recruitment of sand skinks at all. It's the soil, stupid. That's the most important thing. I should also mention that these animals are now in their third generation of survivorship on this site. Okay. One of the other things on the earlier slide I showed you is that there have been records of, and also publications of sand skinks in improved pasture, Bahia Grass pasture. This is the site I showed you earlier. You remember that one? Okay. All these were described as Bahia Grass improved pastures. None of them were pastures. None of them, it was never fenced. It was all orange grove that burned out. The largest patch of Bahia Grass was less than the size of this room. It was adjacent to a road, and the seeds off a vehicle probably started it. What is the truth? Here's the truth or at least what I think the truth is. In 152 samples in Bahia Grass pasture, we have 0 positive hits. Not one evidence of sand skinks actually occurring there. In native xeric, 94% of the samples, of the areas that were sampled were positive for sand skinks. You're going to see in a minute why, because they're incredibly abundant. In human-altered sites, and I don't have another site because I don't have a lot of time, in human-altered sites, here's what we found. If the soils are correct, 55% of the human-altered sites, it could be old field, it could be orange grove, it could be all these other things, and I'm not talking about flatwoods, 55% have sand skinks. Sand skinks were detected in 55% of them if they were immediately adjacent to native xeric, if they had a source to colonize the altered environment. In 146 cases where we sampled an altered site, same kind of sites, that had no direct connection to native xeric, there's a road between or something, 0 hits. If they don't have a source to colonize, they're not able to get there. Okay, I mentioned the trap out enclosures. Here, what we have over here is a frequency distribution of the densities of sand skinks in the 61 trap out enclosures. Mean density is 181 adults, mostly adult individuals per hectare in all those sites. The 95% confidence interval around that is from 1 to 44 to 218 sand skinks per hectare. Thick. What does fire do to them? This is time since last fire. The densities increase the farther you get away from a fire. That's absolutely backwards from what we used to think. One, they do turn into crispy critters. That's a problem with the fire. And the other is you've got to have the leaf litter and the detrital fall to build up the invertebrate populations as a food source for the animals, but to get really dense. I should also mention that one of these in here is an old field site. It was an abandoned orange grove that hadn't burned for over 18 years, and it had densities in the 300 per hectare range. Okay, so now we know, with a reasonable estimate of the densities, what can we learn or detect about the animal and its current distribution. I showed you earlier a map. This is a convex polygon hole around all the positive and negative hits. And what we've done is we've divided all the suitable soils either above 25 meters or below 25 meters. Why the 25 meters? That's what the service, based on what they had in their heads and the literature at the time, only occur above 25 meters. Well, if you look on the Mount Dora Ridge, okay, that's Ocala and all that, almost 20% of the records of sand skinks are below 25 meters in elevation, but on those skink soils. In the Lake Wales Ridge, here and here, in the Lake Wales Ridge, in contrast, about 7% of the positive hits are on those lower soils. And so those lower soils are important. The other thing that is very clear is that they don't only occur on the Lake Wales Ridge, but we have a number of individuals that after the sea levels went down were able to cross these inhospitable habitats and arrive on these islands. This really is Micronesia. It's not Florida. Okay, it's islands in the stream. This is the Lake Henry Ridge. I don't have any of the red points on the map. I've got over a dozen negatives there. They were not able to get there. Okay, let me sum up. Combining the information we have on the densities of sand skinks and the available habitat in the range, it's going to be a shocker for a number of you. Maybe. There we go. Okay. The first of the sets here are on the ridges only. This are estimates from Ethne in 2010. What they did is they mapped all scrub, sandhill, and scrubby flatwoods down to a ½ acre in 2010. So now we have really good habitat data if we only consider the native habitats. And if we multiply the amount of native habitats by the mean densities, 181 per hectare, these are the estimates of the total population on each of the ridges. And here's the grand total in the area of occupancy. Archbold right here where we are, on only native xeric habitats, the best estimate is over 250,000 individuals on Archbold. But they don't occur in this room because the soil are quite right. But there's the acknowledgments. I want to thank you for your patience. It's a pretty remarkable conservation story on the Lake Wales Ridge now. 55% of the likely occupied habitat of Florida sand skinks is under conservation easement, by the way. The best estimate in the conservation areas on the Lake Wales Ridge is 2.18 million, or about 55% of the total estimated population on the whole ridge. And so we've done a great job there. And then Ocala National Forest is loaded with it. Thank you.